Gathered to discuss the proposed voyage around the world, we meet the most influential members of the Institute of Incoherent Geography. President Paul Hunter announces the arrival of engineer Krzysztof, originator of a marvelous scheme. Krzysztof explains his project, which will employ every known means of locomotion: railroads, automobiles, dirigible balloons, submarines, boats, etc. The Institute enthusiastically votes to proceed with the unparalleled plan. The interior of a machine shop in full blast. Krzysztof is plunged into algebraic calculations. The servant brings him his breakfast. But Krzysztof is exasperated by his insistence. Members of the projected expedition arrive to examine the progress of the work. Krzysztof shows them a unique trend of his own invention. A submarine boat perfected, an icebox, and 1,000 other accessories, the purpose of which we will explain later. In another part of the shop, Krzysztof showed them the casting of a colossal piece of machinery. Standing too near, Mrs. Paul Hunter is suffocated by the smoke and faints. Somebody calls for water. The lady comes to her senses, wet and hungry. Preparations are complete. The members of the expedition go and purchase their tickets on the Paris to Sund line. Everybody embarks in the train. Two laggards arrive just in time to see the door close in their faces. The Crazy Loft Expedition Special traverses the Swiss landscape, complete with 2 dirigible balloons, an automobile, an icebox, submarine, and a carload of passengers. Everybody die train, Jungfrau Station. The inhabitants of the country await the coming of the Geographical Society, whose sensational arrival has been heralded. Some freight handlers lower the auto from the train and push it outside the station. The 14 travelers embark in Crazy Loft's impossible carriage, decorated with colossal lanterns, a monstrous projector, and a horn of unheard of dimensions. Little time is lost in their journey to the inn. "Do not disturb yourselves," said the chauffeur. "We are only passing through." Crazy Loft increases the pressure and darts on at 300 miles an hour. The carriage leaps over valleys and mountains. The carriage comes to a rest at the bottom of a precipice, where it is smashed to pieces. Fortunately, a party of guides and mountain climbers come to their aid and extricate them from their painful situations. The lame savants are borne away by the guides to a stay of 5 weeks in the hospital. Cured, but not demoralized, they ask only to continue their journey. Crazy Love sends his train to the summit of the Jungfrau. The train arrives in full blast at the summit, leaps off, and sustained by the dirigible balloons, flies off into space. Dawn appears, the clouds scatter themselves little by little. The sun rises. The ray The savant crawl out from under the heap. And after having been counted, recognize with joy that in spite of their unheard of adventure, nobody has been hurt. Crazy Love, enthusiastic over the novelty of the landscape, leads the savants in the discovery of this unknown country. Suddenly, the warmth of the rising sun becomes intolerably hot. The unfortunates see themselves doomed to a certain death in a temperature of 3,000 degrees. Crazy Love remembers the icebox. Crazy Love, ready to collapse, has remained to the last, and is only too willing to go in when he sees that all are out of danger. But an appalling spectacle presents itself to his sight. The savants, suddenly frozen, are imprisoned in a block of ice, in attitudes most grotesque. The flame crackles joyously, melts the ice, and frees the savants. Crazy Love cries to them to get out and leave at the earliest moment these inhospitable places. It is necessary to return to Earth at the earliest possible moment. The savants, at a hurtling gate, return to the scene of the disaster, and among the wreckage of the train, they find that the submarine boat has been miraculously saved. They open a hatchway, and all scurry head over heels into the boat. Happily, the engineer has foreseen all. At the moment when the submarine falls into space, a folded parachute spreads out. There is fire on board. The savants make superhuman efforts to put out the fire with buckets of water. In a seaport, the sailors are busy with their occupations. They are suddenly knocked over and laid flat by the explosion of the submarine, which has just taken place a short way out from the shore. A piece of the boat falls among them. The sailors leap up frightened and rush to examine the singular thing which has fallen from heaven. They are amazed to see come out the savant who by a wonderful providence have been sent into space with the remnants of the boat and have fallen to earth without experiencing any severe wounds. Kreiseloff, carried on the shoulders of some stalwart sailors, brandishes with pride the propeller of the submarine. He will keep it as a souvenir of his incredible expedition. Upon returning to the Geographical Society, the savants report the results of their voyage to all the notabilities of the land, who declare the impossible voyage a resounding success.
Our hero, Prince Charming, has been refused the hand of the Raja's daughter and driven from the palace. Grieving in his apartment, the prince weeps bitterly. With an unintentional movement, he overturns the incense burner, which falls to the floor, sending forth thick clouds of smoke, out of which there gradually appears the sorcerer Califar. The sorcerer inquires about the causes of the prince's despair. Califar hands over to Prince Charming a magic sword and at the same time tells him that it will render him invincible and that he takes the prince under his protection. If the prince has courage and pledges himself not to shrink back before any ordeal, the enchanter promises to pilot him in the acquisition of a mighty treasure, the location of which is known to him alone. Once in possession of this wealth, the prince will force the Raja to bend before him. The prince's friends determine to follow him in his quest. In the temple of Shiva, Buddhist priests are making a sacrifice upon the altar. The Vestal virgins on their knees are praying to their goddess. The priest bears away the remains of the sacrificial victim. The sorcerer Califar, after having assured himself that the temple is entirely empty, leads the prince up to the altar. Shiva grants the prayer of the prince and at once makes a most extraordinary Indian pavilion emerge from the ground. From it came forth the boatmen of the sacred river who placed themselves at the service of Prince Charming upon his voyage. Some Brahmins, at the command of the goddess, bring forth a magic vase crowned with an enchanted plant. This dwarf is no other than the chief of the boatmen of the sacred river. Charming hesitates to accompany this extraordinary being, but the goddess orders him not to delay a moment and to blindly obey the various guides whom she is sending along. The dwarf leads out the prince, who is followed by the boatman. The banks of the sacred river. The high priest of the magic forest, having been forewarned, comes to meet Charming. The high priest is accompanied by the protecting nymphs of the forest, a forest into which no mortal is permitted to penetrate. The protecting nymphs lead Charming towards the magic forest. The stems and branches of the magic forest are so interwoven that passage is impossible. Suddenly, at the command of the high priest, the trees begin to move. Some Buddhist statues, crumbling down from decay, settle down into the ground. The long dangling stems rise up to the topmost branches. The wild animals, disturbed in their lairs, sneak docilely away. And finally, the last trees, bursting apart, disclosed the ruinous entrance to the wonderful caverns. And there, at the opening, is the fairy of gold, resplendently beautiful as a statue. The prince's friends gather closely around him. The fairy of gold commands the prince to follow. The high priest, having finished his mission, leaves with his guardians. A spiral way winds down from the crystal grotto to the bowels of the earth. Suddenly, they hear a mysterious noise, and seized with a panic, they hide behind the ruins of broken columns. They are hardly concealed when the genius of fire begins to manifest their presence. The prince and his suite, being reassured at hearing nothing more, emerge from their hiding places. In a twinkling of an eye, the cavern is invaded with shadowy specters which come out of nothing. The party discovers the ruins of a vast subterranean temple. The earth yawns and gives passage to a dragon whose enormous mouth vomits forth flames and sparks. Faithful to the promise he has made to Califar, the prince remains firm. He is next confronted by a host of enormous toads. The toads are transformed into monsters of stone. From one of these comes the enchanter, Califar, who compliments the prince on his courage and announces to him that he will receive his treasure as a reward. The monsters of stone are changed to lotus leaves, which slowly unfold one after the other. The fairy of gold springs out of one and ascends into the air. The group of goddesses disappears and is transformed into a bewitching fountain of fire. At this instant, there springs up from the ground a temple of surpassing splendor. A group of dancers representing nymphs of gold come out and seek the prince and escort him into the palace of the Arabian Nights. Everywhere hang robes of precious stones. The prince takes his seat upon the throne which the nymphs have prepared for him. the Fairy of Gold reappears. At her command, a huge vault comes into view, created out of nothing. The Fairy of Gold tells the prince that his courage has been rewarded by the bestowal upon him of the magic vaults with their fabulous riches. Henceforth, he is its sole and rightful proprietor. The day of the wedding of the princess has arrived. At the moment when the Raja is about to present his daughter to an old man she doesn't love, there is a shocking surprise. An imposing entourage approaches. It is the prince with all his riches and his servitors. The Raja cannot believe his eyes. Dazzled by so many treasures of wealth, he bestows upon the prince the hand of his daughter. The heralds proclaimed the marriage of the prince, who ascends the terrace of the palace where he receives the felicitations and the oath of his people amid the wildest acclamation. And they lived happily ever after. Visiting Paris, King Leopold of Belgium ardently desires to make a trip to Monte Carlo, but his time is so limited that he cannot give up the 17 hours for the express train to the Riviera. he chances to meet an automobile manufacturer who proposes to accomplish the journey in 2 hours, starting in front of the Paris Opera House. Luminaries of the opera, theater, and vaudeville wish them a safe and pleasant journey. The automobile manufacturer and his royal companion provide themselves with an ample supply of gasoline. Unfortunately, the king is a novice at running a machine. He drives it backwards instead of forwards. The august traveler is not disconcerted by so trifling a matter. With a few vigorous strokes of his tire pump, he starts the man to swell, but as he has no time to lose, the king leaves the work to various bystanders. The automobile descends a precipitous slope, at the bottom of which it knocks a postman who has remained deaf to the tooting of the danger horn. The automobile pursues its way over mountains and valleys, makes a leap of the most dangerous sort, and lands most happily upon its wheel, whilst the two automobilists remain riveted to their seats, preserving a serene and calm demeanor. Certain cities of France, notably Dijon, still have town dues, where everybody who enters is forced to pay fees in order to have admitted combustibles, no matter whether they be charcoal, wood, petroleum, or gasoline. owners of automobiles often try to profit from the speed of their machines in attempting to escape from the payment of taxes, which they owe because of the stock of gasoline on board. The auto reaches the coast of the Mediterranean. There too, it pulverizes everything, and an unfortunate fruit woman sees her oranges used as missiles by the crowd of promenaders. The automobile prefers to destroy obstacles rather than to lose any time navigating around them. Continuing its wild course, the automobile has a sorry meeting with a wagon filled with tar. The force of the shock creates a terrible explosion. The spectators flee, more or less used up by the catastrophe. In the magnificent gardens of Monte Carlo, a bevy of pretty women are waiting for the arrival of the royal traveler and his guide. The speed of the machine is so great that the king does not succeed in stopping it. The king and his companions are acclaimed by all the spectators and receive their enthusiastic felicitations upon the magnificent exploit which they have just accomplished so brilliantly. outside George III Inn, as the crowd of drinkers congregates about Rip Van Winkle to hear his funny stories, Sheriff Derrick informs Rip that he must go to prison if he has not the money to pay his taxes. He calls on soldiers to carry Rip to prison, but Rip manages to escape and flee to the fastness of the mountain. Hurrying among rocks and tangled underbush, Rip makes his way to a secret cave. The soldiers advance in pursuit for him, keeping step together. As they have lost all trace of him in his locality, they go away in another direction. In turn, Rip's friends set forth at nightfall to find the fugitive hiding in the forest. They pass and repass at a rapid gait before his hiding place, while calling out for him at the top of their lungs. But Rip does not disclose himself, for he supposes that they will prevent him from pursuing his search for Hendrik's Hudson hidden wealth. Finally, his friends give up all hope of finding him. They disappear by the tortuous path of the mountain. They are followed by Rip's youngest child, a tot, carrying a lantern far larger than his body. Then, Rip emerges from his vine-covered hiding place and begins to dig again for the money. But fatigued, he throws his pick aside and falls exhausted to the ground. Presently, he is fast asleep. A cry, Rip Van Winkle, reverberates through the forest. He awakes to see a strange little man in a jerkin with a keg on his shoulder. He beckons to Rip, then helps him up, and promises to show him a larger and richer treasure hidden in another part of the Catskill Mountains. The gnome begins to turn somersault when suddenly he is changed into a huge, grotesque serpent. Rip seizes an axe and chops the serpent into 3 pieces. And the one remaining is changed into the original little man of the mountain, who first appeared to Rip in his dream. The latter now grasps hold of the gnome's hand and is borne away to the spot where the pirate's loot lies buried. In another part of the mountain, even wilder and rockier than before, the gnome points to crevices in the rocks, and Rip rushes to collect the money. But suddenly, ghosts dart up. They are the crew of the Half Moon, and Henrik Hudson himself is the ghost on the central pedestal of rock. Presently, a lovely woman enters with a large drinking cup and pitcher. She pours a liquid and presents it to Rip to sip. In his fondness for drink, he drains the bowl and falls to the ground, asleep almost instantly. The potion in the cup proved so strong that Rip lay buried in a death-like slumber for 20 years. Lo, an aged man with long hair and beard, is seen disentangling himself from the brush. He wins his way out from this lonely forest and seeks the village where his friends, wife, and children are living. Rip comes down the steps leading to the Georges III Inn, where he had spent so many idle hours drinking and chatting in days of yore. He's astonished that the old inn has become a fine new structure known as the Georges III Hotel. He sees his daughter. She so resembles his wife that he mistakes her for his spouse. In his efforts to embrace her, he is pushed off his feet. The people of the place know him no more, and when he tries to explain himself, he is rebuffed. He craves for a drink. His daughter points to the well. Rips draws a bucket of water, but when he stoops to drink, he starts back at seeing the reflection of an old man in the glassy surface of the liquid. He insists upon talking to people, but his story is so strange that he is thrown out of the place by an impatient crowd. Rip is lying asleep by the path where he had fallen from exhaustion just after he had emerged from his cave and begun to dig for more treasure. Simple Simon comes down the slope looking for him. He shakes Rip and makes him get up. Simon tells him that he has only been dreaming and leads him back to the town. When Rip says that his awful dream shows the result of drunkenness and that he would never touch another drop of liquor, his wife and children are overjoyed.